The 44th Ordinary SADC Summit is set to take place in Harare this coming Saturday. Heads of state and government officials are expected to discuss policy issues within SADC. Joining us now is Thembisa Fakude, Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues. Thembisa, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, we know that this summit takes place annually, and the question that gets asked ever so often is whether this summit has anything to show for the people of the region.
Well, nothing has been visible or concrete that has come out of this summit since they started taking place some couple of years ago. Instead, we see, at least in this case, people that continue oppressing their own being celebrated and invited. Case in point, King Mswati of Swaziland is there, or at least the entourage from Swaziland will be there. And importantly is that this is hosted by Zimbabwe, which is known over the past couple of years and months of oppressing its own people, suppression of basic human rights, and jailing its own people.
Sad, but I want us to start. I want to go into those issues in a second. But I want to start first with a theme that says promoting innovation to unlock opportunities for sustained economic growth and development towards an industrialized SADC. And there's a case in point right now. I mean, South Africa and Botswana are over, at loggerheads over agricultural exports. And one wonders whether such issues do indeed find expression, because, from someone I was speaking to yesterday, I think it was AfriBees, who was saying this is not an issue just between Botswana and South Africa, but this is an issue for the region, actually, and hoping that it's one of the issues that this summit would tackle.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's supposed to be tackled, and I think the theme is putting a cart before the horse, because there are basic, the basic tenets that needs to be introduced, at least in the region, in terms of access to education, access to transportation, before we can talk about at least fourth to fifth industrialization and all the beautiful things and jargons that are used to market this summit. The region require much more basic intervention, particularly when it comes to education, especially when it comes to women in this region who are still, by and large, disadvantaged, and yet they play a very important role in socio-economic arena of the region. So, although there are challenges between countries, including Botswana and South Africa, there are other basic issues that I think need to be tackled over and above these common and everyday butting of heads between these countries. And I think South Africa, of course, South Africa tend to be too democratic at times when it comes to it dealing with its neighbors, notwithstanding its size of the economy, its muscle, and access to very important ports in Southern Africa. It still deals with these countries as if they're equals, for lack of better term. I think South Africa, if it wants, it can take a much more tougher position, particularly when it comes to matters of export, like other countries are doing. But we have been very democratic, for a lack of a better term, in terms of how we want to solve our problems, particularly with Botswana and others in the province who have since taken a different position when it comes to South Africa's position on trade and export.
Well, I mean, if pronouncements made by leading top bureaucrats as well as politicians in our countries, private partnerships are being entered into. Not only the region, but the continent as a whole is making progress in terms of the African continental free trade area. Yes, the movement is slow, often goes the admission, but hey, progress is indeed being made.
Yeah, I think so. I think progress is being made, but at the same time, I mean, some of us are arguing whether we should be that open in terms of, negotiations when it comes to access to ports, exportation of goods and services, notwithstanding that we've got ports that are South African ports and are managed and financed by South Africans, that should come at a price for those who want to continue using them. So I sometimes wonder, fail to understand why we should be having discussions at that level, particularly this debacle between South Africa and Botswana on export. While we have, I think, a much more upper hand in terms of dictating what we feel will be of national interest to South Africa, we find ourselves often wanting to reduce a discussion into a discussion between equals, and yet we are not. We have, with due respect, much more, access and the wherewithal for us to conduct trade and export in this regard.
Of course, an issue a lot of people are raising, certainly raised with the Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola, as he was leaving for Zimbabwe, an issue that some South Africans believe the president should raise when he gets there, is the crackdown on activists and the opposition in the country that is hosting this summit this time around, Zimbabwe.
Yeah, indeed. Again, we use these platforms as platform of equals. Yes, there are supposed to be platform of equals, but outside the platforms, at least this one, in a parallel, we should exercise our muscle. And the Zimbabweans expect better from South Africans, that they will speak hard and truth to the government of Zimbabwe, that continue to embarrass us, by the way. The continuing, quiet diplomacy which came into prominence during the time of President Thabo Mbeki continues unabated, notwithstanding that we have a country that's hell-bent on suppressing basic human rights and jailing its own people. And again, that has got, some sort of, it indicts South Africa indirectly, because South Africa is expected, at least by the free and bigger world that has seen us flexing our muscles, whether it's in Palestine, Western Sahara, Cuba, they expect us to do the same when it comes to Zimbabwe, which is next door to us, but we hardly do that. And that's, again, as I've said, diplomatically and in terms of international relations, it's quite embarrassing.
Speaking hard and speaking the truth is something we hardly do, or at least we have no experience of that, as you point out. I mean, that situation is unlikely to change, or am I being pessimistic?
Well, I think let's hope and pray it's going to change, because South Africa has actually bitten more than it can chew in international relation matters, particularly, as I said earlier, on Cuba, on Western Sahara, on Ukraine, on Palestine. We hope that this time around they'll do the same thing. It's based on principle, and our foreign policy is a principle-based foreign policy, and one will expect, of course, that they will speak sense, loudly so, by the way, not through quiet diplomacy, as it's been the case, against Zimbabwe, which continues to, blemish the entire international relations of SADC.
Well, of course, you also have, the kingdom of Eswatini. I guess Zimbabwe is under the spotlight because they are the host, but you do have your Eswatinis as well.
Indeed, and Eswatini is also going to be very prominent. We have stopped talking about that. But again, the atrocities and suppression of rights continue unabated in that tiny little country that's surrounded by South Africa. And one would expect, again, given the excess muscle and power that South Africa has over Eswatini, everything that goes to Eswatini must come through South Africa. South Africa will have had a much more stronger position and demands, for that matter, for that country to democratize. But we hardly hear a word of condemnation, or hardly hear a word of encouraging reforms in that country. Instead, what we see happening every time King Mswati visits South Africa is giving a red carpet. And I'm sure when it gets to Harare, there will be all smiles between President Cyril Ramaphosa and the King Mswati. That's something that the people from Eswatini will expect to seize.
Well, we shall see. Thembisa Fakude, thanks very much for your time and insights. Really appreciate it.